I would be remiss not to mention the particular occasion of this talk, which is the publication by Tan Books in Gastonia, North Carolina, of my most recent book on the sacred liturgy, The Once and Future Roman Rite, Returning to the Traditional Latin Liturgy After 70 Years of Exile. This book is the most ambitious of all that I have written so far, because it enters the most deeply into the enormous theological implications of the liturgical reforms of the 20th century. In this book, I argue that tradition in all its varieties is normative in Catholicism, and that there are discernible laws of organic development by which we can see the divine origins and the fittingness of the traditional Roman Rite as it grew to its Tridentine fullness, like an acorn into a grand oak tree. I show that the Novus Ordo of Paul VI, issued in 1969, is a different rite, bearing superficial resemblances, but different at its genetic level. That Benedict XVI's legal solution of speaking of two forms, though it was clever, was destined to fail as knowledge of and devotion to the traditional liturgy increased. And that Francis is right to say there is only one Roman Rite, but entirely wrong as to which rite deserves to be called by that name. I demonstrate that Paul VI's arguments for creating a new rite are fallacious, implausible, insulting, and self-destructive, and that popes do not have unlimited authority over liturgical rites, even in their non-essential aspects. I explain why the interpretation of history and theology required in order to support a wholesale deconstruction and reconstruction of the liturgy is inherently Protestant and modernist, and not Catholic. I discuss how the Roman canon, the most majestic of all Eucharistic anaphoras, is an inseparable component of the Roman Rite, transmitting in its purity the faith of the Church of Rome. I prove that the Novus Ordo is estranged from the company of all authentic rites of East and West, having little to no overlap with them. Lastly, I argue that the Tridentine Rite must be restored in its fullness, which means prior to the severe distortions introduced by Pius XII in the 1950s and by John XXIII in the early 1960s. I speak here of the Mass and the other sacraments, the blessings and pontifical rites. I must leave the divine office out of the picture, as it is a far more complicated subject. In truth, the pre-55 Roman Rite, as it's sometimes called for convenience, is the pristine and plenary form of liturgy that Western traditionalists are more and more zealous to recover. And this is a cause of the greatest joy for those who know how magnificent the pre-55 Roman Rite is. That indeed is why I mentioned 70 years in the subtitle of the book. 70 years takes us back to the immediate post-World War II period when Pius XII first allowed the axe-wielding academics to lay violent hands on the Roman Missal, starting the rapid descent into an incurable revisionitis. Such is the ambitious argument of the once and future Roman Rite, and I can gratefully report that many readers have told me how accessible and compelling they have found it. So much so that the book, I'm happy to say, is in its second printing and is being published in Spanish, Italian, and German editions so far. Maybe there will be more. If these questions are of interest to you, or if you know someone to whom they would be of interest, by all means pick up a copy this evening. In conclusion, as many of you will know, the Vatican has dropped several bombs on the faithful who embrace Catholic tradition. The first was Pope Francis's July 16, 2021, Motu Proprio Traditionis Custodes, which, incidentally, could be accurately translated as prison guards of treachery. Traditionis Custodes could be translated that way. And I don't know if they speak enough Latin at the Vatican these days to know about these double entendres, but anyway. And its accompanying letter, documents in which flagrant falsehoods greatly outnumber the remaining half-truths. The second was the Responsa ad Dubia of the Congregation for Divine Worship, dated December 18th, 2021. The third was the rescript obtained by Arthur Roach on February 20th, 2023. There may be others yet to come. The Vatican seldom acts with such vigor on any other issue, even the outright heresy and schism of the Germans. Are we looking at something like a final solution for these rebellious traditionalists? Under the paradigm of old-school ultramontanism, which some still seem to believe, it would have been assumed that all Catholics from the chancery to the nursery would rally round the successor of Peter and his trusty curial band. In reality, the reactions of bishops around the world have been decidedly varied, ranging from mindless compliance to generous dispensations to Carthusian silence to, dare I say, Jesuitical duplicity. And what is more, laity and lower clergy have been stirred to a white-hot zeal by what nearly the entire world, including the culturally unsympathetic, interpreted as a gratuitous declaration of war, being carried out with a punctilious legalism and a heartless rigidity that reeks of hypocrisy when emanating from the prophets of sheep-scented peripherality, Abrahamic dialogue, and limitless mercy to sinners. In short, thanks to Pope Francis and, to a limited extent, the FBI, the traditionalist movement has been given its biggest internal boost and greatest advertising campaign in history, with more Catholics becoming aware of the issues at stake than ever before, with evidence of more widespread curiosity, sympathy, and support, and a rekindling of the fervor that characterized the then much smaller traditionalist movement in the most difficult period it faced, circa 1969 to 1984. The Pope's reckless indulgence of willful absolutism in defiance of the common good and of common sense has prepared its own reversal, as rank on rank of true guardians of tradition rise up to defend, preserve, and promote the received and approved rites of Holy Mother Church. This is, after all, how Roman Catholics should behave towards their own venerable tradition. And someday, in God's good time, we can count on having a Catholic Pope who behaves the same way. Thank you for your kind attention. So I'll make a couple of comments because it's, of course, an enormous topic. But the first comment I'll make is that the proponents of, the Pope, Cardinal Roche, people of that mindset, they want to slap an equal sign between Vatican II and the Novus Ordo. That's what they want to do. But you can't slap an equal sign between those two because the Council called for a certain limited number of modifications to the Roman Rite. And after the Council, vastly more changes were made to the liturgy than Sacrosanctum Concilium of Vatican II ever even suggested or even dreamed of. So something happened after the Council, something that traditionalists tend to view as a sort of a manipulation of it, really. That is that Paul VI allowed Annibale Bugnini and his team, the Concilium, to run in a very radical direction according to their own academic theories, going far beyond what the Council Fathers discussed. And Joseph Ratzinger has many times said, I was there for all 4 sessions of the Council. I've read every one of those speeches multiple times. Nobody was ever talking about the Novus Ordo. That's not what they were talking about. And a sign of that is that when the Novus Ordo was previewed by bishops at a synod in 1967, they were not pleased with what they saw. There was a very mixed result in the voting. Okay, so
Catholic, the Novus Ordo is the new form of Mass.
Yes.
Non-Latin Mass.
Yes, exactly. So basically, there's a traditional rite and there's a modern rite. Okay, the traditional rite is characterized by the priest always faces eastwards. I don't want to get too much into details, but he always faces eastwards together with everybody, so his back is turned to the people. It's conducted in Latin. It often uses Gregorian chant. There's a lot of talk in there of mortification and grace and sin and judgment and so-called hard sayings of the gospel, right? Everything is scripted down to the nth detail, down to the last degree. It's very orderly, very disciplined. There's a lot of silence. I mean, it has all these characteristics. The modern rite can have some of those characteristics, but usually it doesn't. And the reason is that it was designed to be flexible and adaptable and has lots of options. And so it ends up looking, you can almost not have 2 Novus Ordo Masses that are exactly identical. I mean, in some rare cases you might, but there are so many options that they tend to vary quite a bit. And typically what's happened is that they've been done in a manner that looks that brings in some of these modern attitudes that I talked about. That is less emphasis on sacrifice, more on community, less silence, more talking, and less sacred music, more music that sounds like modern popular music, etc. So the differences between the traditional rite and the modern rite are profound and numerous. This is not a minor difference. I mean, it's quite a vast difference. And behind those differences are doctrinal and moral issues as well. And that's what I think the traditional movement, as long as people think about the traditional Catholic movement, that is the movement to recover this older form of worship and to value it as the church always had done before, if you think of it as just a question of aesthetic preference, like, okay, some people like, fancy vestments and gold chalices and lots of incense and lots of Gregorian chant, and other people don't like those things. No, it's not just about taste. It goes much deeper than that. Of course, the surface level is important. There's a wonderful quotation from Oscar Wilde, who said, only superficial people don't judge by appearances. Typical Oscar Wilde witticism. But that is to say, the surface level tells you what people think they're doing, but it does go far deeper than that. It's not just a matter of preferences. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Over here.
Yes.
Do you hear this talk? Did they know it like?
Oh, of course they do. Yeah, I admitted that in my talk, right? So really, maybe a more blunt way of saying what I said in my talk, although I don't know how much blunter I could get actually, is to say that for some modern churchmen, and I always like to talk about churchmen rather than the church. We have to be very careful when we say, but well, I'll get to him in a second. But for some churchmen today, they would rather see churches empty than traditional churches. That is, they'd rather see a church empty and shuttered and closed and sold off to the Muslims than have a church filled with young families at a Tridentine Mass. I'm sorry, it's terrible to say that, but that's true. That's the level of corruption we're dealing with some individuals. Where does that come from? Honestly, if there's goodwill at all, then it would have to be the assumption that the modern way is the only way to be a Catholic or a Christian, and if you can't be it that way, then you might as well not be it at all. That would be one way of if they were a really dyed-in-the-wool modernist, then they might think the traditional form of Catholicism is not just out of date, but it's harmful for people. It's better not to be that, right? But they could also be Freemasons. That's not a conspiracy theory. There are Freemasons. Cardinal Gagnon was asked by Paul VI to investigate Freemasonry in the Vatican. He did investigate it. Father Charles Moore has written a couple of books about it, Murder in the 33rd Degree, The Godmother, and there's pretty decisive evidence that lots of high-ranking church officials have been and probably still are Masons. Some of them could be Satanists. Malachi Martin, Windswept House. I've read that novel. If you have a queasy stomach, don't read that novel. It's really disturbing in some ways, especially the opening. But I could say there are definitely possibilities about why this is going on. Archbishop Lefebvre, I can only say one thing briefly about him, which is that he understood. He signed off on what the Vatican II documents were saying ad literam, that is just what they said, as the other Council Fathers did. He did not expect a revolution, the revolution that happened. That's why later on he said, I was tricked, basically. We were tricked. This was a bait and switch, was a good way of putting it. And Cardinal Casper said the same thing. He said in an interview, which you can find easily on the internet, that the people who drafted the documents of the Council, they knew that there were different perspectives, and they deliberately wrote ambiguous passages so that they could be taken in either direction, but knowing full well that the progressives were going to take the upper hand and were going to drive it in that direction. So, that's what I have to say about that.
Anybody else?
No. That would be overstated somewhat. Fraudulent. The problem with the word fraudulent is they could be taken in different directions to mean different things. I've never denied the validity of the Novus Ordo. I don't think the Church is capable of issuing a liturgy that's not valid, by which I mean a liturgy that doesn't actually accomplish the sacrament that it purports to accomplish. So the Novus Ordo Mass transubstantiates the Eucharist, and we receive Christ there, and that's a glorious thing. I don't question the good intentions of those who use it as well as they can, or who attend it as well as they can. But what I'm saying is that when you study the history of the liturgy and the theology of the liturgy, you realize there is a rupture that is very harmful to the church. And that rupture eventually needs to be healed in some way. And I think Pope Benedict, the genius of Pope Benedict XVI, is that he was trying to heal it in the most gentle way possible, which is to say, he wanted to let there be freedom he was a laissez-faire Pope in a way. It's kind of ironic, I was saying this to some other people earlier today, that Pope Benedict had the best ideas on the liturgy, but he also had the most modest view of what the Pope is. And therefore, he didn't want the Pope to ramrod everybody, and say, okay, now it's time for everybody to go back to Latin tomorrow, which is what happened in the 60s. He didn't want to do that again to people, but he thought, you know what, if I just let this be free, if I let the lion of the traditional Mass out of the cage, it can fend for itself, And eventually, over time, he thought there would be a mutual enrichment, so he thought that priests would learn the old Mass and it would affect how they celebrate the new Mass, which certainly was happening and still does happen. And I don't even think he knew what the ultimate goal was. He probably thought, I don't need to know what the ultimate goal is. I just need to let there be this freedom for people to rediscover the sacred and rediscover tradition. And I think that if that had been allowed to continue, which frankly is what most of the bishops wanted, this survey that the bishops did, we'll never see the results of that survey because the results were actually favorable to Summorum Pontificum, right? And I know that because I know somebody, a journalist in Rome, who saw the results of the surveys, and she said it was probably about 60% positive reactions of bishops saying Summorum Pontificum is fine, we have no problems in our dioceses, we should let it go forward. So I do think that would have been a healthier and saner approach. I think what Pope Francis has done in this area, as in so many others, he has in a way radicalized the conversation in a way that I think is almost unavoidable. I mean, the issues are really grave issues, very serious issues. The people who are in charge of the Novus Ordo, what I mean by that is like the Dicastery of Divine Worship, the official body that's in charge of the Catholic liturgy right now, has radically wrong ideas about what's to be done and what was done even and why, that are dangerous for all of us, whatever form of the Mass we go to. But yeah, I mean, I do think that ultimately it would be better for the clergy themselves and better for the faithful to move back to the traditional rites of the Church. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. How important is the Latin language versus just what's in the Tridentine Mass, which of course can be translated into many languages, just as we see in our vernacular, in our bilingual missals, right? Well, there was a question earlier that I didn't answer part of it, which is related to yours. I do think that if after the council, the reform of the liturgy had been very moderate, and if part of that, or even instead of that, the Tridentine Mass had simply been put into vernacular languages, that we certainly wouldn't have the liturgy wars, so to speak, that we have now. I do think there would still be something like a traditional movement because people would be very sad to have lost the greatness of the Latin language of the liturgy is truly an awesome work of art. It's like a Shakespeare play. It's like Dante. It's an awesome linguistic phenomenon that is comparable to, say, Church Slavonic in the Russian Orthodox tradition, or to the Koine Greek that the Greek Orthodox use in their worship, or to the Coptic that the Copts use. Right? I mean, there are these languages that are old, ancient languages that were once closer to common languages, but have over the centuries have become sacred, have become symbols of divine worship because nobody speaks them anymore, right? Or very few people can speak them. And so I think that we would lose something very precious if we gave up the Latin. And certainly the council didn't want it to be given up entirely, right? It just wanted certain things to be in the vernacular. But to just say, there's a bigger answer to that question in a lecture I gave called Why Latin is the Right Language for Roman Catholic Worship. And you can find that at Rorate Caeli if you're interested in reading more about that. No. So this is a very weird thing about liturgists and just modern churchmen in general, is that they have this tendency to be very pro-Eastern and pro-Byzantine. They praise the East for its reverence and its beauty and everything. But then they turn around and they have the opposite attitude towards the West. It's the most bizarre thing in the world. I can't really understand it. I've tried to understand it. There's some kind of self-loathing that goes together with the admiration of the exotic. Like the East is exotic for us, and so we admire it and we say, oh, isn't that wonderful for all those Eastern people? But for us, well, we need to have a stripped down vernacular English, blah, blah, blah sort of thing, not what they do. And so it's actually very inconsistent. It's deeply inconsistent. One of the chapters in my book, Once a Future Roman Rite, is a close comparison of the Tridentine Rite, the Byzantine Rite, and the Novus Ordo. And it just shows how the Tridentine and Byzantine line up on one major issue after another, and then the Novus Ordo doesn't line up with them. Or when it does, it only does so optionally. Yeah. Yes, yes. No. And in fact, I agree with that. And I would go further and say, it was especially ironic that the church was, or that certain people in the church, I don't really think it was ever a majority view, were pushing this idea of total vernacularization right at a moment in human history when people were traveling more than ever and when cultures were meeting with each other more than ever, so that there was more than ever a reason to have one language at worship, that no one could say, oh, you're being imperialistic, right? Because like if we force Hispanics to pray in English, it seems like we're forcing them to do something. Or if they make us, or we might resent being forced to go to a Spanish liturgy because I can't understand it. But everybody is capable of using a missal, and the Spanish speakers can bring their Latin-Spanish missal, and the English people can bring their Latin-English missal, and it all works just fine. I went to this one fraternity mass in Vancouver where I saw in this one parish, it's the only parish in the city of Vancouver where you have blacks, Hispanics, Vietnamese, Chinese, white people. They're all there at the same mass, worshiping side by side. That's so beautiful. That's so Catholic, right? I mean, there are the obvious things like just keep going to your traditional Latin masses to make sure that the numbers are, everybody has lots of options. There are questions of scheduling, and this is more convenient than that. But even at some cost of inconvenience, it's still worth supporting our Latin masses that we have, to make sure that if a bishop, I mean, I've heard positive things about your bishop, but if a bishop is wondering, well, how important is this really? Do we really need to keep this? Like, well, Your Excellency, there are 300 people that come to this. Like, this is this is a big thing. We can't cancel it. That's definitely going to have a lot of weight. I very strongly recommend that people explicitly pray their rosaries for the intention of the restoration of tradition in the Catholic Church. And maybe even just leave it that broad, because it's not just about the liturgy, as I said in my talk. It's about a lot of things.
Peter, thank you so much for
Thank you all for being here.